it's about reclaiming that story, hearing new stories, and changing the narrative. We have had the honour to work with so many different local groups who also share our passion for history. This is just a few of the projects. The first one 15 years ago we started off with was Black History in Dorset, and that was 400 years exploring the presence of black people in Dorset. Then we moved, because we found so much out about the GI experience and the African American GI experience in Weymouth here, that we did a whole project on that. We also worked with a group of East Dorset schools, looking at life histories and family history in their own schools with their own children, and retelling that and making an exhibition around that and writing a book about it. And then we also recently done a few more community heritage projects, working with some of the recent refugees who have come to the area, and also working with the Egyptian traveller community. And these are just the ones that Dee's has organised, but I want to say thank you, and I can see she's back there, to Natasha Player. From those days, you mowed your arts network, but she has always partnered us, and she's always asked to work with Dee on her heritage projects, and I'm trying to remember the names of them. Dancing Nepal and Carnival Connections. So there are a team of us out there working on this work, and obviously we have to go to funding for everything needs funding. We go to the Heritage Fund for a lot of our work, but it's difficult to get it. There are people desperately wanting to tell their stories, and we are working to try and catch that. We have limited resources, we're from the voluntary sector. So we work hard to do what we can with the stories we can. And it's amazing when we get to hear all these fantastic stories. The interesting thing about it all is that this is the local perspective. So I'm here to start us off with the local story. And one thing that I want to say, sorry, before it goes on, not everything has come up on these slides actually, so I'll say what's on the slide. Is that Black history is local history. And one of the things we can often do, BCP and Dorset area, often what is shown, what is celebrated in the BCP and Dorset area is the traditional view of history, the Victoriana, the Hardy's country, the Jurassic coast. Often we celebrate that as our heritage, but we forget the black people that were part of that. They were part of Victorian Dorset and BCP area, they were there. They are entitled as much to Hardy's country. They passed through working on the farms and also being part of the coast and living here. So it is part of this sort of traditional image that we have of BCP and Dorset, but often we leave the black people out, and that's partly what we're here to try and challenge, is to put that story back in. One way, because black people are often ignored or left out or hidden in history, one way, and this was alluded to earlier on, was to write their own stories. And I can't say how important autobiographies are in the power of words and being able to write your own story, because that's how we found out so much about certain people who lived in this area. That is how we found out about Thomas Lewis Johnson. Thomas Lewis Johnson retired in Bournemouth in about the 1890s. But why we know about him is because he wrote an autobiography talking about his life, and it's stored digitally. Without those autobiographies, we wouldn't know so much about Mary Seacole, we wouldn't know so much about Laudo Equiano. Writing your own story is so powerful, and that's partly what we are in the business of, is gathering people's stories in and writing them down, because otherwise you don't get that version, you don't get their version of it. And Thomas Lewis Johnson was a really interesting character. He was enslaved on a plantation in America, and when that all ended, he became free. He worked as a missionary in the Baptist church, and that enabled him to travel the world. And he travelled the world preaching, talking to people, preaching the word, and he became ill because he travelled so much. And he came, like so many others, to Bournemouth to take the waters, enjoy the climate, and retire here. So he has a very similar story to some, but very, very different in others. So he's a very interesting one to learn about, is Thomas Lewis Johnson. And we know so much about him. As you can see on the corner there, he wrote this book in 1909, and it was published in Bournemouth, and he even put his address on the book. We even know where he lived in Boston, in Paisley Road in Boston. And we even know he was buried in a cemetery in Boston because he left a paper trail. And so much of Black history is not, there's no paper trail. And the job we have is in finding it, really trying to find this paper trail of people. Andrew Bogle, that's a picture of Upton House in Poole. Some of you might have gone over there in the summer holidays, visited it quite often. Andrew Bogle was brought to Upton House in 1828 as a servant of the person who owned it. Had brought him out of being enslaved in Jamaica, brought him over when he had that house to be a servant in his house. And then the only reason we have so much about Andrew Bogle is because there was a whole big law court case about the Titchbourne claimant. His owner, the person who owned that Upton House, was Edward, I think, Titchbourne. And there was a whole big famous case about who could claim the property. And that meant that Andrew Bogle was called as a witness to authenticate who was the real Titchbourne claimant. So there are court records of him, there are photos of him, and that photo I got in the National Portrait Gallery. So there are places where you can dig and you can find these stories, and it makes me think, makes me wonder, all those lovely stately homes we have around Dorset, about how many black servants were in there. But because they were undervalued, the thought was not important, their stories weren't written down. Only he became important because they needed him to be a witness in a court trial. And this is partly where we go and we dig back into these things. And I'd love to see around all these stately homes, see their records of who worked for them, and there will be them. There will be this dispersed community of the black working class around the 19th century, who were the servants, the nannies, the sailors, the soldiers, all doing that sort of work, all dispersed, but travelling through this trading area, because Bournemouth and Poole, they're on the coast, they're a very rich trading area. So it really makes me think of those communities that were early formed almost 200 years ago.